was 21 years old when I started working the night shift at a gas station outside of Amarillo. At the time, I was trying to save money to move into my own apartment, and the gas station was one of the only places in town hiring that would work around my college schedule. The pay wasn't great, and the hours sucked, but honestly, the job itself was pretty easy most nights. The station sat right off a long stretch of highway about 15 minutes outside the city. During the day, it stayed pretty busy because truckers and travelers were constantly stopping in for gas and food, but once midnight rolled around, the place became almost completely dead. Most nights between 1 and 5 in the morning, I'd see maybe 5 customers total. Usually it was truck drivers buying coffee or exhausted people grabbing snacks before getting back on the road. I worked alone during the night shift, which didn't bother me at first. I actually kind of liked it because I could watch movies on my phone between customers and just relax while getting paid. The first few weeks went by completely normally. Nothing strange happened. Then one Friday night, everything changed. It had been storming most of the evening. Not heavy rain, just a slight drizzle mixed with occasional thunder that rattled the windows every now and then. Around 2 in the morning, the station was completely empty, and I was standing behind the counter drinking coffee and watching rainwater run down the windows. I remember feeling exhausted. I had worked a full shift at school earlier that day before coming into work, and by that point I was struggling to keep my eyes open. That's probably why I jumped so hard when I heard knocking on the glass. The sound startled me because I hadn't seen a car pull in. I looked up and saw a man standing outside the front doors. At first, I could only make out his outline because of the reflection on the glass, but as he stepped closer under the light above the entrance, I got a better look at him. He looked rough, maybe mid-40s. He had long, greasy hair hanging down around his face and a soaked gray hoodie that looked almost black from the rain. He wasn't smiling, just staring at me through the glass. I remember thinking it was weird because the doors weren't locked. He could have just walked inside. Instead, he stood there knocking slowly with one finger against the glass. Something about the situation immediately made me feel uncomfortable. I walked over and opened the door and asked the man if he was all right. The guy didn't answer right away. He just looked past me into the store like he was checking if anyone else was in there. Then he looked back at me and asked if I was alone tonight. The question immediately put me on edge. I kind of laughed awkwardly and told him no, that my manager was in the back. Obviously, this was a complete lie. The man stared at me for another couple seconds before nodding slowly and walking inside. As he passed me, I caught this awful smell coming off of him. It was like wet clothes mixed with something rotten. He wandered slowly through the aisles without grabbing anything, while I returned behind the counter pretending not to watch him, but I was watching him. He would stop at the end of the aisle and just stand there motionless for a few moments before moving again. Eventually, he brought a bottle of water to the register. As I rang him up, he kept glancing toward the windows. He asked me if I was working all night, and I nodded slightly and told him unfortunately I was. He smiled a little at that. It wasn't a friendly smile either, more like he found something funny that I wasn't aware of. He paid in cash and walked out without another word. I remember feeling relieved watching him disappear into the rain, but then I noticed something strange. There was no car. I looked around the parking lot expecting to see headlights somewhere, but the entire lot was empty. Apparently, the guy had walked here. That didn't make much sense because the station was surrounded by miles of highway and empty fields. Still, I tried not to think about it too much. About 20 minutes later, I was in the back cooler stocking drinks when I heard the front door chime go off again. I groaned quietly because I hated getting interrupted while stocking shelves. I walked back toward the front expecting another customer, but when I stepped out into the store, I froze. The station was empty. There were no customers, not even a car outside. I immediately looked toward the front doors, and they were closed. That's when I heard it. There was a faint metallic scraping sound coming from one of the aisles. It sounded like someone dragging something against the shelves. I slowly stepped around the corner, staring toward the aisle where the sound came from, and called out hello. Immediately, the sound stopped, and the store went completely silent except for the hum of the refrigerators. I stood there listening for a few seconds before convincing myself maybe a customer had walked in and then left. I turned around to head back to the counter when the sound happened again. This time it was closer. I spun around quickly toward the aisle, but there was nothing. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the convex security mirrors mounted near the ceiling showed part of the aisle from an angle I couldn't directly see from where I was standing, and in the reflection, I could see someone crouched low near the shelves. They were just barely visible, and they were watching me. My chest tightened immediately, and I backed toward the counter and grabbed the cordless store phone. I called out, telling whoever it was that they needed to leave right now and that I was calling the cops. For a moment, nothing happened, and then slowly, a man stood up from behind the shelves. It was the same guy from earlier, except now he was smiling, and in his hand he held a screwdriver. I felt every bit of blood drain from my face as the guy started walking toward me slowly, dragging the screwdriver against the metal shelving as he moved. The sound echoed throughout the store. I stumbled backward behind the counter, nearly dropping the phone while dialing 911. The man kept approaching me slowly. He wasn't running or yelling, just smiling. Then he spoke, telling me that he thought I said that my manager was here. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons on the phone. The guy reached the counter and leaned over it slightly, staring directly at me. Then he said something that still freaks me out thinking about it. He told me that he waited outside for 15 minutes after I left, and nobody else ever came in. At that point, I was in full panic mode. The 911 operator picked up and I immediately started yelling for help. The man's expression changed the second he heard me talking to someone, and that smile disappeared instantly. For the first time, he actually looked angry. He slammed the screwdriver down into the countertop so hard it stuck there, standing upright. I jumped backwards so fast I fell onto the floor behind the register, and then I heard footsteps running, but not toward me, toward the door. A second later, the front door slammed open and shut hard enough to rattle the windows. I stayed on the floor shaking until police arrived about 10 minutes later. When they checked the parking lot, they found muddy footprints circling the building near the side windows. The officer believed the guy had been watching the station for a while before coming inside, probably trying to figure out if I was alone. What bothers me most, though, is something the officer said before he left. Apparently, a few months earlier, there had been another night clerk working alone at a gas station about 40 miles south. They found him beaten nearly to death in the stockroom after closing. They had never found the suspect. I quit that job 2 days later, and even now, anytime I stop at a gas station late at night, I catch myself looking through the aisles, expecting to see someone crouched there watching me through the shelves. I was 24 years old when I started working overnights at a gas station off of Interstate 70 in Kansas. It wasn't supposed to be a long-term job. I had recently moved out there with my girlfriend because she got accepted into a nursing program, and I needed something quick while I figured out what I wanted to do. The station paid decent enough, and since I had always been more of a night owl, the overnight shift seemed perfect for me. The store sat completely by itself off a rural highway exit surrounded by open farmland, and there was a motel across the road and a closed-down diner next to it that looked like it hadn't seen customers since the 90s. During the day, the place stayed busy enough, but at night it felt isolated, especially after 1 a.m. when traffic almost completely disappeared. Most nights followed the exact same routine. I'd clean the coffee machines, restock the coolers, mop the floor, and kill time watching YouTube videos behind the register while country music played quietly over the speakers. The only thing I hated was taking out the trash. The dumpster sat behind the building next to a tree line, and there were no lights back there except for a weak yellow bulb mounted above the metal door. Every time I went back there at night, it felt like someone was watching me from the trees. Still, nothing ever actually happened, until one night in October. I remember it clearly because there had been a huge cold front that rolled in earlier that evening. The temperature dropped almost 30 degrees in a few hours, and by midnight, freezing rain had started falling. The roads were mostly empty because of the weather. But around 2:15 in the morning, while I was wiping down the counters, an older blue van pulled into the lot. At first, I didn't think much of it. Travelers stopped here all the time. But what caught my attention was where the van parked. Instead of pulling up near the pumps or directly in front of the store, it parked all the way off to the side, near the air pump, where the security cameras barely reached. The engine stayed running. I glanced outside a few times while pretending to clean, but nobody got out. After about 5 minutes, I started feeling uneasy. I figured maybe someone was sleeping in the van or on the phone or something, but the situation just felt off to me. Then the headlight shut off. For some reason, that immediately made my stomach tighten. I kept staring out the window, waiting for someone to step out, but nobody did. About another minute passed before the store phone rang. The sudden noise startled me enough that I jumped. I grabbed the phone and answered, but there was silence. I frowned and said hello. For a few seconds, all I heard was static. And then there was breathing, very slow breathing. I pulled the phone away from my ear a little and repeated hello. The breathing stopped, and then the line disconnected. I remember just standing there staring at the phone for a second, trying to convince myself it was probably some prank call. That's when the front door chime went off. I looked up expecting to finally see someone from the van, but instead a young woman walked inside. She looked freezing. She was maybe in her early 20s, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans soaked from the rain. Her hair was wet and stuck to the sides of her face. The weird part was I hadn't seen her get out of a vehicle. I hadn't seen anyone walking through the parking lot earlier. She walked quickly up to the counter looking nervous and asked me if she could use the phone. I pointed at the one in her hand without even thinking. She glanced down at her own phone and shook her head, telling me she didn't have any signal. I thought this was a little strange, but I nodded and handed her the store phone. As she started dialing, I looked back out toward the parking lot. The blue van was still sitting there, with its engine running. Something about it made me uneasy enough that I finally asked her if she was all right. She looked toward the windows immediately, and then back at me. She asked if anyone else had come in here tonight. I told her no. Her face tightened a little after hearing that, and then suddenly she hung up the phone before it even started ringing. She whispered quietly to me that I needed to lock the doors. I actually laughed a little because the way she said it caught me off guard. She repeated herself, telling me I needed to lock the doors now. The fear in her voice instantly changed my mood. I looked back toward the parking lot again, and the van's doors were open now. I swear they had opened silently because I never even heard them. And standing beside the van was a man. He was tall and wearing a dark raincoat with the hood up. I couldn't see his face. He was just standing there, staring directly at the gas station. The woman stepped away from the windows and said, "That's him." My heart immediately started hammering. I asked her who the guy was, but before she could answer, the man started walking toward the store. He wasn't running, but just walking steadily. The woman backed away from the entrance and again told me that I needed to lock the doors. That finally snapped me out of whatever frozen state I was in. I rushed around the counter and hit the lock switch near the entrance just as the man reached the doors. He grabbed the handle and pulled once, then again, harder. The doors rattled loudly. I yelled, asking what he wanted, but the man didn't answer. He just kept pulling on the handle while staring inside. The woman suddenly grabbed my arm hard enough that it hurt and said, "Do not let him in." Something about the way she said it genuinely terrified me. The man finally stopped pulling on the door, and for a second he just stood there motionless in the rain. Then slowly he lifted one hand and pointed toward the woman. I turned toward her confused and asked her what this was and if she knew the guy. She nodded slightly but didn't answer. Then I saw the man smile. I could barely see it through the rain and the darkness, but I could tell he was smiling. And then he did something that made my entire body go cold. He reached slowly into his coat and pulled out a roll of duct tape. My stomach dropped instantly. The woman let out this terrified sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 immediately. The man saw me doing it and suddenly slammed both fists against the glass so hard the doors shook. This caused the woman to scream. I stumbled backward while trying to explain to the dispatcher what was happening. The man circled toward the side of the building, disappearing briefly out of view. That's when I remembered the back door, the employee entrance near the dumpsters. I sprinted toward the hallway leading to the back room with the woman right behind me. The second we reached the stockroom, we heard the metal door slam open. He got in. I still don't know how. Maybe the door hadn't latched completely after my last trash run, but now he was inside the building. We heard heavy footsteps moving through the back hallway. They were slow and deliberate. The woman grabbed my sleeve, whispering that we needed to hide. I killed the stockroom lights, and we crouched behind stacks of soda boxes near the far wall. The dispatcher kept talking through my phone, but I could barely focus on her. All I heard were the footsteps, and then silence. Then footsteps again, this time closer. The stockroom door slowly creaked open, and I could see the outline of the man standing there in the darkness. Neither of us moved. I could hear the woman quietly crying beside me, trying not to make noise. The man stood there for probably 10 seconds without moving, and then he spoke. He said that he knew that we were in there. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. He said that he just wanted to talk. The woman beside me started shaking violently. The man took a few slow steps into the room, and I remember gripping a metal pipe from the shelf beside me so tightly my hands hurt. The footsteps kept getting closer. Then suddenly, red and blue lights flashed through the front windows of the store. The man froze instantly, and for the first time he seemed panicked. He turned and sprinted out of the stockroom just as officers came rushing through the front entrance. They caught him behind the building, trying to get back into the van. Turns out the woman had escaped from him earlier that night at a motel a few exits down the highway. The police later found zip ties, knives, and plastic sheeting inside the van. I quit that job the following week, and to this day I still avoid stopping at isolated gas stations late at night. And every time I see a vehicle parked far away from the pumps with the engine running, I immediately leave.